The Pharisene Paradox was a short story written by R.S. Wilt and included in the Warhammer horror anthology The Resting Places, released in April of 2023. The story follows Elisar, an interrogator of Ordo Chronos, a man who had once been on a promising career path, but ended up being left behind, abandoned in deep space, forced to spend his days toiling away in an endless purgatory of data feeds, with nothing but lobotomized criminals to keep him company. Little does he know that his life is about to change forever, and deep within the hellish bowels of a desecrated void ship, he will be forced to confront the eldritch horror of the grimdark future alone. He will learn that sometimes what stares back at you in the mirror is far more terrifying than even the most dangerous of foes. So come with me, my friends, as we settle in for another entry in the Grimdark Story Hour, and listen well to the tale of the Pharisene Paradox. But before we dive headfirst into the Grimdark, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor.
Today's video is sponsored by Displate, a truly unique company that makes some high-quality metal posters with some absolutely amazing prints. These things are ridiculously durable and made to withstand a lifetime of intense staring. As much as I love their product, it always drove me crazy that they didn't have anything from Warhammer. Well, Displate must have been reading my mind because they just announced a collaboration with Games Workshop and added a ton of amazing posters from Warhammer 40,000 to their store. They sent me a couple of these to try out, and if I'm being honest with you, I'm completely blown away by how professional and durable these look. The print quality is ridiculous. And if Warhammer isn't your thing, then I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know how you ended up on a video about Warhammer's lore. But fret not, because Displate has over 1 million designs, including many from legendary franchises like D&D, World of Warcraft, Elden Ring, and plenty of other games and movies. I was also pleasantly surprised that they were easier to mount than a regular poster, as they use this innovative safe magnet mounting system that protects your walls and only takes about 20 seconds. No need to drill a bunch of holes or anything like that. Just wipe the wall clean, stick on the protective leaf, place the magnet, and put the Displate on the wall. It's as easy as that. And on top of all that, Displate is an eco-friendly company that plants a tree for every design sold. You really can't get much better than that. Click on the link in the description of this video or use code WESHAMMER at checkout to get 32% off your order when you pick up 1 to 2 Displates, or 38% off your order if you pick up 3 or more. Big thanks to Displate for sponsoring this video.
Our story begins on the command deck of Watch Station Aetium Aurum in the 739,999th year of the 41st millennium. The watch station had been commissioned by Inquisitor Astrojarbus of Ordo Chronos, an eccentric man of science turned inquisitor. In his service to the Inquisition, he had witnessed a long series of seemingly unrelated temporal events and believed that the most likely source of these anomalies was the nebula itself. To that end, he designed and ordered the construction of the watch station so that it could remain under surveillance at all times. Whatever truth the Inquisitor had gleaned amidst the roiling energies of the nebula was something that he never shared openly, not even with his most trusted interrogator. Interrogator Elisar of Ordo Chronos stepped onto the command deck and greeted all 40 of the servitors that manned their stations.
Greetings. What excitement do we have today, friends?
None of the servitors replied, they never did, but it didn't stop him from attempting pleasantries from time to time. The only time that they ever spoke was when requested to vocalize the endless feeds of data that they analyzed each and every second of every day. With a heavy sigh, he sat down at his command throne and prepared himself for another long, boring day. Articulated brass arms lowered from the ceiling, bringing with them a bevy of crackling green screens. Just as always, they presented him a disorienting barrage of endless data concerning the nebula. It was the same thing every day, hour upon hour of shifting through trivial data for anything of note, while surrounded by lobotomized drones that, frankly speaking, it weren't much for conversation. Elisar was a proud man and was determined to do his best for his master, but having been the only living soul aboard the watch station for over 3 months, left him feeling dreadfully lonely, his hot cup of recaf each morning being one of the last remaining things he looked forward to. He strummed his fingers rhythmically against the armrest of his command throne, hoping against hope that maybe finally something interesting would happen this day. Hell, he would take one of the servitors malfunctioning and be in need of repair. He needed something to keep him from going mental. But if every long and lonely day that had come before these past 3 months were any indicator of future events, he wasn't expecting much. As if in acknowledgement of his thoughts, the universe responded with a sudden explosion of powerful, turbulent energy that erupted like a tiny supernova in front of the viewport. The shockwave was so abrupt and intense that it reverberated all the way through the superstructure of the watch station. Proximity Claxtons began howling in warning, and the blast caused multiple systems across the bridge to begin furiously spewing forth a barrage of sparks. Several of the servitors began to convulse as the electrical power surged through their stations. Out of the burst of light came a ship, an ancient wreck of a vessel. Even without the use of the long-range visual scanners, LSR could clearly see that it had widespread damage across the entirety of its hull. Its real space engine stuttering as it pitched forward head over tail in a morbid death spiral through space. The long-range scanners began furiously spewing forth a stream of data that identified the vessel as the long-distance freighter known as the Pharisene. The streams reported catastrophic damage. Large sections of the ship were completely open to the void, and although its engines were sputtering and pulsing, desperately trying to stabilize the tumbling vessel, they were clearly too damaged to right her. She looked as if she had been the victim of a dozen wars without repair, but despite the bad shape that she was in, the scanners indicated that in multiple sections throughout her body, life support had remained stable. The servitors began murmuring incessantly in their seats, spewing out a stream of vocalized data.
036 Mark 270 Mark Vagabond class merchant fleet freighter. Plasma drives malfunctioning. Freighter Pharisene. Calthian origination markings. Range 207.67 miles and closing. Departure logged 08809999 M41.
26. Repeat your last.
Vessel's departure logged 08809999 M41. Terran Stand.
Stop. Repeat again.
Vessel's departure logged 08809999 M41. Terran Stand.
Stop. Thank you. That can't possibly be right.
LSR stared at the log report on his display and compared it to the current date. If this was correct, it would mean that the ship had set out on its voyage a month and a half from now.
A month and a half. 26. Is this log correct?
Vessel's departure logged 08809999 M41. Terran Standard.
Stop. Yes, I got that.
He thought back to the last thing his master told him, to keep an eye on the nebula. At the time, it just seemed like the Inquisitor telling him to do his job. But this, Order Kronos did not believe in coincidences, and LSR started to suspect that his master had not been entirely forthcoming with him when he placed him in charge.
What did you know, Master? What is aboard that ship?
Relatively speaking, the Pharisene was about 207 miles away from the watch station, but it was closing in fast.
Likelihood of impact with the watch station.
82.78% at current bearing.
Estimated time of impact.
39 minutes.
He made multiple attempts to hail the vessel, but each request was met with cold, dead static. There wasn't time for this. LSR pushed the glass screens out of his face and jumped out of the command throne. He needed to get over to that ship, get aboard, and stabilize its engines in order to move it out of harm's way. The immediate danger aside, he suspected that his master had some hand in this. He'd always been an eccentric individual, and there was a high likelihood that the Pharisene's sudden explosive emergence was another one of his experiments gone awry.
Ready a lighter. Plot coordinates to the Pharisene.
Compliance.
LSR sat in the passenger hold of the Arvis-class lighter, fingers drumming nervously on the strap of his ship repair tool-filled rucksack. He listened to the sound of the vessel's servitor pilot engaging all of the necessary systems before taking off and slipping out into the void. He turned and looked out of one of the viewports and witnessed a thick cloud of debris orbiting around the stricken vessel. He wondered what kind of hellish journey the Pharisene had been on. What terrors in the warp had she seen? The shuttlecraft sat down in the docking chamber near the Pharisene's port beam, and LSR listened to the sound of the rust-encrusted void shutters grinding shut behind them. Once the chamber had been sealed, pressure and atmosphere gradually returned. He stood up and looked over the servitor pilot's shoulder and consulted the Auspex readings. Gravity was nearing standard, and although the temperature was below freezing, it was survivable. The atmosphere was thin, but it was breathable. By his calculations, he had about 29 minutes until impact. He was going to be cutting it tight, but he should be able to get the ship's engines operational once more. He picked up his rucksack, slung it over his shoulder, checked his bolt pistol, and stepped out into the hangar. He was hit with a wave of bitter cold that numbed his lips and made his eyes water. The landing bay was completely dark, devoid of even routine servitors. The only illumination he had was from the lighter's headlamps, but compared to the cold, suffocating darkness he found himself engulfed by, they seemed weak and feeble. It was as if this yawning space hungrily devoured all illumination. He took out a stab light from his rucksack and swept it around the hangar, searching for a way forward. The hangar itself looked as if it had not been maintained for decades or perhaps even centuries. Rust and frost covered every surface, and the deck itself was corroded and pockmarked. Eventually, he was able to locate a large heavyset steel door, but when he attempted to open it, he found that it had frozen shut. He looked around and located a discarded steel bar and used it to wedge into the space between the hatch and the bulkhead. He threw all of his strength into it and managed to pry it open, the seal crackling with the breaking of ice crystals. A wall of stench and hot air rushed through the open door and struck him with almost physical force. He choked and gagged as the unmistakable odor of rot and decay assaulted his senses. He fought down the compulsion to vomit and steadied himself. The room on the other side was illuminated, but only faintly, with the eerie red glow of emergency lumens. This area of the ship was still cold, but significantly warmer than the hangar. Paint sloughed from the rusting bulkheads, and the flickering red lumens caused their papery strips to twist into all manner of strange and ominous shapes. Trying to get his bearings, he swept his stab light around the room, and that's when he saw the first of them. There were corpses here, several of them littering the corridor's corroded decking. The scent of old death saturated every inch of this room, lingering like an ancient protective spirit that jealously guarded the dead. It was then that he heard the telltale signs of the hatch he had come through wheezing shut. Our story jumps forward a few minutes, and we find Elisar rushing through the Pharisene's endless labyrinth of corridors. If he was going to make it in time to stabilize the engines, he was going to need to move quickly, or else he would end up joining all of the rotting corpses that lined the corridors. Additionally, he had become convinced that his master was somewhere aboard the ship. Despite the old man's overconfidence, he was clearly in need of rescue. Although he had never been aboard the Pharisene, he had been around many freighters in the past and knew their general layout. Even still, the risk of getting turned around and hopelessly lost was an ever-present threat. The ruin that had been inflicted upon the Pharisene was comprehensive, yet even still, he found himself amazed by just how remarkable this vessel truly was. Her ability to survive in the void in such a miserable condition, let alone remain warp-capable, was absolutely astonishing. He journeyed deeper inside of the ship and would frequently have to work his way through tight corridors or duck beneath exposed and crumbling structures. On multiple occasions, he had to bypass areas that had been sealed off due to a breach in the hull. And at one point, he had to maneuver around a lake of spilled coolant in one of the lower decks, where he witnessed the bloated, buoyant remains of what he assumed to be the crew, bobbing lazily in the yellow-green fluid. The further he ventured into the ship, the more corpses he encountered. Void ships like this were known for having a full complement of crew members, sometimes more than was necessary. But this, by his estimation, there were thousands of them. Every hall he passed through, every chamber he ventured into, he could feel the cold, lifeless eyes of hundreds of dead bodies watching him in the dark with morbid curiosity. There was not a single inch of the vessel outside of the hangar that was not covered in the dead. They lounged in endless repose, dried effluvia seeping from their rotten bodies, staining and corroding the plasteel decks beneath them. The concept of being surrounded by so many dead bodies was disturbing enough, but there was something else. Something about them just wasn't adding up. It was as if they had all been killed decades apart. Some were partially fleshed, while others had dwindled away to desiccated husks. There were even those that had reached the point of decay where they were nothing more than a few pieces of blackened flesh clinging desperately to a dusty skeleton. The damage they had sustained wasn't consistent either. The majority looked like they had been exploded from within, a pattern of damage that his time with the Inquisition had taught him was indicative of injuries caused by bolt weapons. Many others appeared to have been surgically dismembered, while even more bore the telltale signs of having been eaten. As an interrogator, Elisar was no stranger to death, but he had never seen it on quite this scale. It was as if the coffers of hell itself had opened wide their great and terrible maw and disgorged the remains of all that ever were directly into the arteries of the Pharisene. The miasma of death was thick and foreboding, repugnantly musty and nauseatingly sweet. He managed to stay strong up until this point, but at last, his body betrayed him. He dropped to his knees and retched, emptying his stomach until he was dry heaving and spitting. Strangely enough, he found the vinegary taste of vomit practically pleasant in comparison to the overwhelming scent of rot. If his master truly was somewhere on this ship, he would have to abandon his quest for him, at least until he could get the ship stable again. Locating the enginarium was now his sole mission. As he sat there wiping his lips on his sleeve, he heard something behind him. a single footstep on a rusted deck. He spun around and drew his bolt pistol, straining to pierce the hazy fog of corpse gas with his stab light. He sat completely still, bolt pistol raised, breath held, and listened. But the sound didn't come again. After several minutes had passed, he relaxed. He let out a deep sigh. Clearly, the sheer terror of this place had gotten the best of his imagination. His nerves calmed slightly, but even still, he kept his pistol unholstered. Several corridors full of dead bodies later, he found himself crossing over a rusty pockmarked catwalk and realized that the enginarium lay almost directly beneath him. As he began his descent into the heart of the ship, the pervasive feeling of being watched began to grow stronger and stronger, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand at attention. He couldn't tell if it was his imagination getting the best of him, or if there actually was something out there, something lurking between the shadows of the corpse piles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As he was trying to shake the feeling off, the sound suddenly came again. This time, from a different location above him, the telltale scraping sound of old boots on decking. He clutched his bolt pistol tight and exited the stairwell, and then turned and looked up, casting a piercing beam of illumination from his stab light directly upwards through hundreds of yards of crisscrossing walkways. The only thing that reflected back at him were the cold, lifeless eyes of the dead. He closed his eyes and listened again, but the sound had gone. All he could hear was the thundering of his own heartbeat and the fading rumble of the ship's slowly dying engines. Then the sound came again, this time from behind him and on the same floor. He doubled back and picked up his pace, hoping to throw off his unseen pursuer by changing directions. After only a minute of this, the sound came once more, this time from in front of him. He turned again and ran, certain that he was surrounded. In a moment of panic, he crouched in the shadows of a cogitator array, listening in the dark for any further footsteps. He took a shallow gasp of thin air, and cold sweat began to run down his neck. Once again, he heard nothing, only his own racing heartbeat. He couldn't hide forever. He had about 11 minutes until impact, and he needed to move. He got up and raced towards the enginarium, ignoring the piles of corpses that steadily grew larger and more numerous the deeper he went into the bowels of the Pharisene. It was then that he felt the ship lurch violently as the long, struggling engines finally died. What little red light from the emergency lumen still existed down here abruptly failed, plunging the entirety of the ship into immediate, silent darkness. An icy knot clenched deep in his stomach, and his throat tightened as he found himself suddenly blinded deep in the guts of a derelict ship, surrounded by the dead. He took a deep breath and cursed the long-forgotten part of himself that had an instinctive fear of the dark. He calmed himself, reburied his childhood fears, and moved on. He drew his stab light, and its narrow beam speared a shallow wound in the gloom, revealing that he had reached the enginarium. He descended down a dust-clotted ladder, half sliding through a barrage of cobwebs, down into the outer annex. At the base of the ladder were two corpses huddled together. He tried to avoid them, but tripped and lost his grip on the stab light. It bounced away, spinning wildly across the filth-encrusted deck. But as he turned to retrieve it, he found himself staring down the barrel of a bolt pistol. He squinted in the dark, trying to figure out who the gun's wielder was by the indirect light of his fallen torch. And one part of him hoped that it would be his master, but the logical part of his brain knew that that wasn't true. He found himself staring at an old man, one whose presence both felt perplexingly familiar and suspiciously foreign. His face was damaged and worn, the erosion of many hard decades having taken its toll on him. He had slate gray, unkempt hair, and the heavily patched leather coat he wore seemed to have been cannibalized from multiple different outfits of the same material. Putting it mildly, he was a ghoulish wreck of a man, clearly unwell, with a faint glint of madness dancing in his one good eye. Elisar took a step back in surprise and tripped over one of the corpse piles. The old man watched him scramble up, but kept the bolt pistol trained on him, his grip trembling ever so slightly. Elisar made no sudden moves and kept his hands visible as he rose.
"You're alone, aren't you?"
He slurred his words as if he were no longer accustomed to speaking.
I boarded the vessel alone.
I know that. I mean, you're doing what he asked. You've been watching over the nebula for him, all alone, or aren't you yet? Has Astro Yarvis disappeared?
Yes, I thought maybe he was here on this ship.
He never was.
The old man's vile breath exuded the Pharisene's fetid death reek.
Astro vanished months ago. I've been waiting for him to return.
How many months ago?
Elisar studied him as he spoke. There was a strange mixture of regret, guilt, and anticipation that twitched across his old features. He wondered what kind of life he must have lived that led him to becoming a tattered ancient wraith haunting the bowels of a dead ship.
How many?
3. 3 months ago.
Three. Three's possible.
3's possible for what?
A broad, rotten grin spread across the old man's face.
For the jump. We just have to get the drives running again, and pray the old girl doesn't shake apart during transit.
The jump?
The warp jump!
He exclaimed, his phlegmy laugh becoming a hacking cough.
3 months will be challenging in the Pharisene's condition, but I think she'll manage. You brought the fuel pressurizer unit, didn't you?
How could you know about that?
You always bring it.
I what?
Look, I'm not stupid. That is to say, you're not stupid. You worked on ships for almost 20 years before Yarvis found you. You see one with crippled real space drives. You remember how old Engine Master Kerrigan taught you to emergency charge a failing plasma reactor?
Pressurizer, hooked into the main fuel feeder line.
He chortled, apparently pleased.
You see? It's a quick fix, burns out fast. You need a replacement every time you use one.
Elisar swallowed nervously.
What did you mean that I always bring it?
The old man's eyes darted to the corpse at his feet and then back to Elisar. His tongue flicked anxiously across his lips.
You have every time so far.
An overwhelming feeling of dread began to creep throughout Elisar's body. He turned and looked down at the nearest corpse. The clothing it wore was tattered and saturated with old blood. By his estimations, it had been several months since this man died. The body had skin drawing over its protruding bones, his left arm was missing, and the wound showed the telltale signs that a bolt round had ripped it free. His right leg had been hacked off with some type of serrated instrument, and his flesh had been peeled from his torso in ragged chunks. Upon his jacket, the man had a small silver pin affixed to his lapel. It bore the infamous eye and skull insignia of the Inquisition, set within a blue hourglass. It was the unmistakable seal of his master. It was identical to the one on Elisar's overcoat. Despite the grisly state of the body, it was the man's face that sent a terrifying jolt of realization through him. This wasn't just some random acolyte of his master that he had never met before. It was unmistakable. He was staring at his own corpse. In disbelief, he turned to another body that lay a few feet away, turned it over, and found the same insignia on the body's ragged lapel. With sheer, barely restrained terror, Elisar slowly turned back around to the old man and saw once again the mark of his master pinned upon the old man's coat. Although time and madness had taken its toll on the old wraith, the resemblance was uncanny. It was like looking into a time-distorted mirror. The old man was him from another time.
Ordo Chronos exist because of abominations like you.
Don't paint me as some kind of monster. You only had to wait 3 months for the Pharisene to arrive. I waited 47 years.
He exhaled corpse stink, his bolt pistol quaking in his grip.
47 years of keeping a weather eye on row 386 Cummings, with nothing but aging servitors for company. Forgotten. I waited for word for Yarvis. Nothing. I sent multiple requests to the Ordo. No reply there either. Why, I hear you ask? Because Astro vanished with the entirety of Ordo Chronos.
You're lying.
I have been voxing status requests into the void for Emperor knows how many years. Had to, since Astro took our astropath with him. I finally got a reply from an Inquisitor, no less. Different Ordo. I don't recall which one. It doesn't matter. He said the whole Ordo Chronos, including Yarvis, vanished. There was my reply. But it was all I got. Guess it was all my clearance as interrogator warranted. No details. No, we've got a ship coming to pick you up. Not even so much as a goodbye and a good luck. Bastards. And so the years passed until the Pharisene appeared. The Pharisene, with her beautifully malfunctioning warp drive. She broke from the Imperial like an omen, a promise to be kept. I could warn Yarvis before he left. The Pharisene was the instrument to reverse my fate. It was only 47 years back, after all. A few days here, a few weeks there, jump after jump after jump. I just had to keep her operational. Difficult proposition, with almost the entire crew dead.
What did you do to them?
Nothing. I told you, I'm not a monster.
He glanced away as if the repressed memories of a lifetime of regret wormed their way through his mental barricades. In the old man's brief moment of introspection, his gun unconsciously lowered slightly. Seizing his opportunity, Elisar drew his pistol and fired. His older version reacted with startling speed, dropping into a crouch. The shot went wide, and the old man immediately took advantage of Elisar's momentary disorientation and barged into him with his shoulder, knocking the younger man to the deck. He leapt on top of him like a rabid animal and rained down a flurry of blows, striking him hard in the temple, causing his head to bounce off of the deck. The old man's eyes blazed with manic fury, and he laughed maniacally as he hammered down punch after punch after punch. Despite the barrage, Elisar had managed to keep a firm grip on his pistol. He raised it and fired again. But just as he pulled the trigger, his attacker swatted it away. The brief break in the old man's attack gave Elisar enough time to kick him off of him. He scrambled across the deck and got to his feet. He spun around and lined up a shot at the exact same time that the old man was doing the same. 2 simultaneous shots erupted, echoing throughout the chamber. Elisar could feel a trail of warm blood running down his neck and a throbbing pain on the side of his head from where the bolt round had glanced him, blowing his ear clean off. He smelled the telltale tang of propellant mixed with the overwhelming metallic scent of aerosolized blood. He dropped to his knees, panting for breath, and laid down beside the headless corpse of the other him, listening to the gushing and gurgling of his blood squirting out over the deck and the dripping sound as it seeped through the holes in the corroded floor and fell away into the darkness below. He rose to his feet and snapped himself back together. He barely had any time left, and he had to make those repairs. He snatched up the stab light and searched the other him's body for anything useful. He took his bolt rounds, a fuel pressurizer, and the tools that he had. He turned and sprinted towards the engine, clamoring over detritus and the dead. The heart of the ship that contained its engine was full of incalculable miles of snaking conduit connected to unfathomable machinery. He had worked on ships in his younger years and was familiar with how to keep them operational, but he was no tech adept of the priesthood of Mars and was not privy to their ancient secrets. Any repairs that he made would only be temporary. When he reached his destination, he tore off a rusted maintenance panel 15 yards away from the warp engines. He wiped away the grease of the main fuel gauge and saw that the Pharisene still had a considerable amount of fuel left. On one hand, this made sense. She was a bulk freighter designed for long-distance travel, but her engineers couldn't possibly have expected that she would find herself on a journey not through space, but through time, always arriving in the same spot she had departed from. He worked frantically, rearranging wires, pulling old rusted levers, and finally removing the burnt-out pressurizer, tossing it into a heap of others like it. He fitted the replacement and tightened it down before striking a red lever upwards that reopened the feed lines. The pressurizer drew fuel from the tanks, hissing in approval as it injected the substance into the plasma reactor's ignition chambers. He found himself panting for breath, elated by his success, but overwhelmed by everything that he had been through. The bodies had been him. They had all been him, each one slightly younger than the last. They had all kept an eye on the nebula and waited patiently for their master's return. With the repairs made, he prepared himself for his final task. His final hope lay with his master. The Inquisitor would need to know what was coming and not to accompany his peers on their fated expedition where the entirety of Ordo Chronos disappeared. For him, though, he knew what fate was coming. Even if he succeeded, even if he managed to reach him in time, he knew his master better than anyone. He was wise, but he was also stubborn. There was a high probability that he wouldn't listen. But who could blame him? He would see Elisar as an anathema, an abomination out of sync with the natural flow of time. The entire Ordo existed to prevent, contain, and destroy time anomalies like himself. Surely he wouldn't want to do it, but he would have no choice. His master would be oath-bound to rid the galaxy of the heresy that Elisar had become. But it didn't matter. Even if he wouldn't listen, even if he had to do his duty, perhaps he could be convinced to take Elisar's younger self with him, to save him from the Pharisene paradox. Elisar would accept his judgment. He would welcome oblivion with open arms if it meant that there was a chance of saving himself and his master in a different time. He had no idea how long the Pharisene's restored life would last, or if the fuel pressure would end up becoming overtaxed like all the others. He drummed his fingers rhythmically on a nearby terminal and calculated exactly how much fuel he would require for a 3-month jump. He primed the warp drive and made sure the Geller fields and life support systems remained stable and prepared to initiate warp travel. he looked back down into the cold, dead eyes of one of his former selves, a body much older than all of the rest. It stared back at him in mocking silence. A dead, rictus grin stretched across its face. It was then that the ship began to shake and shudder violently as the entire superstructure prepared to enter the Immaterium. A station deck collapsed nearby, pitching rusted metal debris and sending an avalanche of the dead tumbling forward. With a titanic wrenching screech, a length of steel bar dislodged itself from high above him and came toppling down directly for him. He couldn't get out of the way in time, and the bar pierced his left leg, tearing through the flesh and shattering bone. As quickly as the violent shuddering began, it died away, indicating that the plasma drives had stabilized. Despite his injury, he managed to key in the final coordinates. With shaking hands, he reached for the initialization rune and struck it. As the Pharisene began its final translation into the warp, Elisar turned around and looked at the hundreds of bodies surrounding him.
I promise you, it'll all be worth it. Only 3 months left to go. One last jump. One final leap into the dark.
And with that, the Pharisene slipped away into the Immaterium.